The bout between Islam Makhachev and Alexander Volkanovski is without a doubt one of the most exciting and anticipated fights in the history of the UFC. MMA fans all over the world are itching to see this fight, but at the same time, no one really knows what's going to happen once the two clash fists. So we're just going to have to trust the expert opinion of the #1 bantamweight competitor, Sean O'Malley. Starting off with Sean O'Malley's weird gut feeling about the Volkanovski versus Makhachev fight. The American UFC star's intuitive feelings on this highly anticipated fight tell him there's a surprise in store for the fans and other UFC fighters. Alexander Volkanovski and Islam Makhachev are set to face each other in the ring at UFC 284, where for the first time ever, the Dagestani UFC titan will have to defend his lightweight title. Makhachev had to take on and defeat the Brazilian UFC star Charles Oliveira for this title back at UFC 280, and ever since then, he hasn't been once challenged for it. Well, up until now at least. This fight isn't just about who ends up getting the lightweight title, though. The end result will also determine the absolute top dog at the UFC. As of now, the Australian UFC star sits at the #1 spot, with Islam Makhachev trailing right on his tail at #2. A lot of people, including fans and other UFC fighters, have chipped in with their opinions on the two fighters and how the fight could likely go down. And the general consensus seems to be that Islam Makhachev might come out on top once the battle's over. People don't feel like Volkanovski has what it takes to become the next double champion at the UFC, mostly because he's up against a Dagestani beast. And we all know how the Dagestani fighters have been dominating the UFC ever since their arrival. Though American fighter Sean O'Malley's instincts have something different to say, and it's telling players not to count Volkanovski out of the fight so quickly. Let's see what Sean O'Malley has to say. Up next is, Sean O'Malley thinks Volkanovski will give Makhachev a hard time in the ring. The American UFC fighter gave his 2 cents on the highly anticipated fight between Makhachev and Volkanovski in a talk with writer, sports radio producer, and sports reporter Helen Yee. Sean talked about how Makhachev is one tough guy, and that taking him down won't be an easy thing to do. But he did add he had a weird feeling regarding the Australian UFC champion. O'Malley thinks that Volkanovski will be a much bigger threat and challenge to Makhachev than what everyone thinks right now. When talking about his thoughts on whether the Australian fighter could possibly take down Makhachev or not, Sean O'Malley said he doesn't know of anyone else who can, if not Volkanovski, and he may just be onto something there. Volkanovski does have an advantage over Makhachev, and that advantage is speed. Alex is definitely the faster of the two fighters. But on the flip side, one disadvantage that he'll probably have is the difference in size. And his lack of size won't do him any favors, and he's up against the wrestling and sambo-style combat of Islam Makhachev. Unless Alex is fast enough to not get caught, he shouldn't have a lot of problems. But that being said, it isn't exactly easy to escape Makhachev's grapples. Sean O'Malley, like most others, also thinks that Makhachev might win the fight, but he just says that Alex won't go down that easily, and that it'll be a great fight to watch. And it will, considering how both contenders have only ever lost one fight each in their UFC careers. Let's talk about the people that took down these MMA monsters. Coming up next is Islam Makhachev's loss to Adriano Martins, and how he recovered from it. At UFC 192, all the way back in 2015, UFC fans thought Makhachev's fight against Adriano Martins would be an easy one for him, considering his winning streak at the time. But the Brazilian fighter had a surprise in store for the Dagestani and for MMA fans. Martins managed to win the fight in the first round of the match, pulling off a big upset and shocking everyone. Martins had been doing pretty well, with a record of 4 wins and only 1 loss after his triumph against Makhachev. However, for some reason, he failed to win any MMA fights after taking down the Dagestani monster. His 2 fights after his match with Makhachev both ended in defeat for him, one against Leonardo Santos and the second against Cajun Johnson. And these 2 fights would serve to be his final bouts in the UFC, which cut him out from the organization. Makhachev didn't let this one loss bring him down for good, though. He went back to his winning ways, and ever since then the Dagestani fighter's been undefeated, even taking down Charles Oliveira and claiming the lightweight UFC title for himself. He's had 10 fights up until that point, 6 of which he won before the full time for the match was over. Nick Lentz, Chris Wade, Davey Ramos, and Arman Tsarukyan were the only people to go all the way against him. He obviously still won the fight though, of course. The Dagestani fighter even took out Bobby Green in an exciting first round victory. Much like him, Volkanovski only has one loss too. Let's see who took down the Australian UFC fighter. Following up is Alexander Volkanovski lost to Corey Nelson at welterweight. With a professional record of over 24 wins and only one loss, it's safe to say that Alexander Volkanovski has been on a pretty big winning streak when it comes to his professional UFC career as a fighter. The Australian UFC featherweight champion suffered his one and only loss all the way back in 2013, in the fourth fight of his professional career. Back then, Alexander Volkanovski used to fight as a welterweight contender. Alexander's first 3 fights and wins were with him at 170 pounds, and all of them turned out to be victories for him. But in his fourth fight, the Australian MMA fighter came face to face with Corey Nelson, and this fight didn't pan out the way he would have wanted it to at all. Corey Nelson completely knocked out Alexander Volkanovski in the 3rd round of the match, handing him his first ever and only professional UFC defeat so far, leaving a stain on his almost perfect personal record. But every fight the Australian UFC star has been a part of before and after this clash with Corey Nelson has ended up as a win for him, leading to the 20-plus UFC win streak Alexander Volkanovski has going for himself right now. There's also a possibility that Sean O'Malley could even take on Alexander Volkanovski in the future. Well, that'll become a possibility if the American fighter's master plan works out for him, though he'll need to focus on the bantamweight title for now, a title he could possibly be in line for as a challenger. Let's take a deeper look and talk about Sean O'Malley's master plan though. Next up is Sean O'Malley's master plan to move from bantamweight to featherweight. Regarded as one of the biggest stars in the UFC, the American fighter Sean O'Malley has revealed the master plan he has for his professional UFC career. The bantamweight fighter even broke the top 15 just recently. The American has been widely known to be very strategic and slow-paced with his ascension as he crawls up the UFC ladder. Sean O'Malley's been picking his fights carefully and purposefully so that he can make his way up the ranks in the division. His plan is to become the champion, and to achieve that goal, he first had to face and take down Pedro Munoz at UFC 276, whom O'Malley thought he could knock out and then keep a winning streak going, as per his talk with Canal and Karada on YouTube. He talked more deeply about his career goals in the interview, revealing how he has to be the bantamweight champion by the age of 45. Since then, he'll be deserving of a shot at the title. O'Malley also talked about how Gervonta Davis could be a big fight for him eventually, and how he'd love to go to the world of boxing. He spoke about how people say boxers can't be taken down by MMA. O'Malley talked about how he believes in his own abilities as a fighter, and believes that about half a decade into the future, he could possibly be the double champion, or the bantamweight, or even the featherweight champion. The American can't think of a reason as to why he can't go out and knock Davis out, if he's still around then, that is. Lastly, what does Joe Rogan have to say about Alexander Volkanovski versus Islam Makhachev? The pay-per-view clash between these two MMA giants will be aired on ESPN and ESPN Plus, as Makhachev will try to defend his title for the first time against Volkanovski. The podcast host, comedian, former TV presenter, and UFC commentator Joe Rogan has his own view on the fight between Volkanovski and Makhachev, and wonders if the Dagestani can handle the Australian's lightning-fast speed. Alexander Volkanovski is moving up in weight classes in order to take on Makhachev the grappler, and Joe Rogan feels like he might not be able to counter the Australian fighter's speed. In a recent installment of his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience, with Sean O'Malley as a guest, the UFC commentator asked if Islam Makhachev has ever fought anyone who moves even nearly as fast as Volkanovski does. Joe Rogan had even more questions asking, what if the Australian keeps catching Makhachev, especially on the feet? He asked what the Dagestani would do if Alex kept avoiding his attempts at a takedown. Though Rogan did address the difference in size between the two, and how it could play a big role in the fight, where the UFC commentator wondered if Alex is a big enough guy to go up against the Russian. He spoke about how Makhachev is a really big dude who has a well-rounded physique and body for his weight class, calling him big and lean. Joe Rogan talked about grappling being the main focus for the fight, and how Islam is a great grappler, but also how Alex has a great defense against takedowns. We'll just have to wait and see the fight between these two beasts. That's a wrap for this video. Who do you think will win out of these two fighters? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.